And it's so nice to take the conversation of Palestine and freedom of speech and artistic freedom forward. So I think it's a very good idea of having these sessions back to back, so the conversation is still fresh in our minds. We take to our next session, where we have Dunya moderating the conversation. It is like about new approaches to funding culture and arts for a decolonized global South in the post-Gaza genocide era. And Dunya is a Casablanca-based cultural practitioner working across Morocco, Africa, and the Arab region since 2008. She supports cultural institutions through training, mentorship, and project development. She co-founded the label HSS with the Moroccan Association for Electronic Music. Her work often explores themes like artistic rights, freedom of expressions, and cultural policy. I give the floor to Dunya now. You can talk about your projects and take the conversation forward. Thank you, Dunya.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rida. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to all the Safe Haven team and organization for hosting us today. It's the afternoon for me, so thank you all for joining us wherever you are. So my name is Dunya, as Rida introduced me, and I am based in Morocco. I'm also the steering committee member of the PACSOC. And the PACSOC, the Palestinian Arts and Culture Solidarity Collective, is a growing and independent network of Global South creatives who are joined by allies in the Global North. And we are working on to sustain Palestinian arts and culture communities through fundraising, advocacy, and awareness efforts. You can find more about PACSOC by visiting our booth in the lobby of the event, and together with you will see more about us and more information about us and about our partners from Owneh initiative. And of course, you can also click on the links that are available there to donate to Owneh initiative, and we will talk more about Owneh in this panel, so you can understand its work and why it's been established. So together with Owneh, PACSOC and Owneh, we are curating this panel about the new approaches to funding culture and arts for a decolonized Global South in the post-Gaza genocide era. And to tackle this issue, I am really pleased and honored to have 3 speakers from across the globe. So I'm going to start to introduce them to you. So we have from Brazil, Naitzi Lopez, who is a journalist, a script writer, and a performing arts curator. Naitzi has curated and organized several events and exhibitions and conferences in the field of dance, performing arts, and cultural cooperations. And she started as a guest curator of the Panorama Festival. And since 2006, she became its general and artistic director of the festival and many other projects in Brazil and beyond. And we also have YARA ODEH, who is a Palestinian, welcome Yara, welcome Naiti, Palestinian practitioner and cultural programmer. Yara is based in Ramallah, where she speaks from today in Palestine. She has a 15-year experience supporting grassroots initiatives through grant making in the field of art and culture and humanitarian sectors. And currently she carries a work that is centered on consistently advancing alternatives to conventional funding models within the complex context of Palestine, which is at the core of our conversation today. And last but not least, from South Africa, we have Mike van Graan, who is an award-winning contemporary playwright. whose work engaged with the personal and the political, both the personal and political. He recently served as the coordinator of the Stand Foundation, which is an initiative to support the South African dance and theater sector through the COVID-19 pandemic. And before that, he was the founding Secretary General of the Pan-African Organization Arterial Network. And Mike is also an expert in cultural policy, he works with different institutions such as UNESCO and also the Ministry of Culture in South Africa and many other institutions. And he is the founding member of the PACSOC back in November 2023. And I'm going to start with you, Mike, and give you the floor to start with setting the broader definitions and the key concept and the contextualization of what we mean by decolonization, and also to try to answer the critical question that we raised when we were preparing this panel. Why is it urgent to decolonize funding structures, in particular in this current context where many international funds align with Israeli interests? Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Dunya. We live in a world characterized by two fundamental fault lines: inequality and culture. Inequality with regard to who has economic, political, and military power, in other words, the means to pursue their interests by coercion, and cultural power, the means to manufacture consent and affirm whose tales or whose stories and whose tears matter. Second fault line, culture, is about our respective beliefs, our value systems, our worldviews, our understandings of ourselves, and of ourselves in relation to others. These inequalities are rooted in the colonial project, where white European powers invaded other lands, committed holocausts against indigenous people, divided their land between themselves, subjugated the remaining local population to foreign laws, enforced by well-armed police and a foreign judicial system, and then forced the locals off their land, making them to sell their labor and serve the colonial powers abroad, and the settler colonial regimes that began to take root in places like Canada, Australia, some parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and of course, the United States of America. That was because of their military, their economic, and their political power. They were able to do that. Their cultural power was rooted in religion and in media and in fundamental racism. Their belief that white people are superior, are civilized, and that people of color are subhuman, are inferior, and in need of white civilization. After the Second World War, in which the barbarism of Europe was exposed through the Holocaust, and the genocidal tendencies of the USA was again exposed in their extermination of tens of thousands of people through nuclear weapons, the so-called West would have us believe that they have now become more civilized, that people of color would now be recognized as human through their countries being granted political independence, and that all of humanity would now be governed by the principles, the rights, and the freedoms contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. This post-war multilateral institution would preserve peace, they told us, while at the same time they were embedding the fundamental inequality of 5 countries having the right to veto decisions that the rest of the world might take. The double standards were further embedded in 1948 with South Africa, country in which I'm located, a United Nations member at the time, electing an apartheid government that denied fundamental rights to Black people. And in the same year, Israel declared itself a Jews-only state, denying fundamental rights and freedoms to Arabs. France and Britain, signatories to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in that same year, still imposed their rule on millions of people across the world who did not have representation at the UN. All people are born equal in rights and dignity, states the declaration, except they are not. They were not then, and they are not now. the Gaza genocide has done anything, it has exposed the absolute hypocrisy of the white Western world, for whom human rights have been for human whites, first and foremost, from the very beginning. Over the last few decades, though, human rights have been the whip used by the wild white West to assume the moral high ground, to beat their real and imagined enemies, to co-opt even those in their former colonies to become complicit in their own oppression, and to accept a globalized world that continues to serve white supremacy in particular. Now, while we may enjoy the mirage of post-colonial political independence and take note of the belated recognition of a Palestinian state by some white Western countries, we have been recolonized through cultural policies, through international trade and mobility patterns that favor the white West. And given the failure of many global South governments to recognize the importance of culture as a means of engaging in the battle of ideas, of values and beliefs, the West's institutions of soft power, like the Goethe Institute, the British Council, the French Institute, and the like, they provide funding and international opportunities aligned to their interests. So we don't want to alienate them, so we suppress our right to freedom of expression. We aspire to their awards, their affirmation, and we are thus ruled by our own consent. Our minds, our hearts, our aesthetic values and aspirations have been colonized. We cannot, we must not allow the world to return to what it was before the genocide. Palestinians are paying too high a price for us to return to the inequalities, to the racism and the barbaric violence upon which the current world order is based. So what now in the arts and culture space? First, we need to reformulate and give new definitions to concepts that we have been using or that global elites have and white supremacists have been appropriating. For example, even the very term civilization. For them, it means their levels of technological sophistication with which they can rain death on people of color, pages, drones, stealth bombers. We need to reclaim a definition of civilization as being about being human, being capable of empathy, of serving the greater interests of humanity as a whole. We need to reevaluate and redefine human rights in our contemporary world, not in the 1948 world. Why do some, mainly people from white majority countries, for example, have the right to travel freely in the world, and people from the global South have to apply for visas if we are supposedly born equal in rights and dignity? Secondly, we need to redesign cultural policies and priorities that recognize and are rooted in the diverse conditions and realities of the global South, and not simply panel beat our projects to fit in with the latest European cultural policy fad in order to access their funding. PACSOC's Cultural Policy Working Group seeks to make a very modest contribution in this regard. And thirdly, we need to decolonize funding for one key reason and in two key senses. The reason to ensure that our policy priorities serve our interests and not the neo-colonial interests of the funding entities. And the two key senses in which we need to decolonize funding is where the funding comes from, and secondly, who makes the decisions about how the funding is used. From the huge marches for Palestine, the music festivals in support of Palestine, there is huge potential to raise funds for independent funding mechanisms, not controlled by states, but by creatives. If states or parastatals are to make contributions, then it must be on the basis of reparations, an admission that they have been complicit in the genocide, whether it be the white Western world or the cowardly Arab regimes. And for funding to be decolonized, it must be the beneficiaries who decide how the funds are used, which mechanisms will best allocate the funds, what criteria of allocation and accountability will be used. This is not for donors to determine, as has been the case till now. And fourth, we need to shift the global geographies of cultural power and influence. We have all been witnesses to the hypocrisy, the double standards, the hollowness, and the corruption of Western cultural players, the institutions that have suppressed pro-Palestinian voices, the media institutions that repeat Zionist propaganda, their funding agencies that require an acceptance of inequality and injustice. We must move away from white power and white culture institutions that consider Black and brown people inferior and expendable. the same impulses that drove colonialism, slavery, and apartheid still apply today. You see that in the marches in 3 million people in the UK. You see that in the activities of the ICE agencies. You see that in the Trump administration. You see that in the genocide in Gaza. Global South governments are by no means perfect, but we need to form alliances with South Korea, with Malaysia, with Indonesia, some governments in Latin America, and a few in Africa. Those that have collectively taken Israel to the International Court of Justice and should perhaps be our starting point. Having said that, it is civil society that must drive these alternatives and not depend on our governments. They will mouth hollow words as they are doing at the United Nations General Assembly at the moment. They'll perform hollow actions, but it's ordinary people who are putting their lives on the line at protests, in standing up to the powerful, in the aid flotillas. The Gaza genocide has helped to draw the line between the monsters on the one hand and those of us who claim to be human. The future of humanity lies with those who act in solidarity with other humans, particularly with those on the underside of white supremacist power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your contribution. It's very clear the way that you see the alternatives of like the colonial alternatives, especially when it comes to funding arts and culture, but not only. You spoke about cultural policies, you spoke about trade, about mobility, about all this unbalanced stuff that are most of the time relying on colonial funding. And it's a very good actually way to give the floor to Yara, because YARA is a part of an alternative initiative that has been established recently in Palestine, and we are talking about the Owneh initiative. And Yara, you can tell us more about Owneh initiative, its purpose, objectives, and area of actions, of course, but also if you could just give a brief introduction about and highlight the specific context of Palestine and culture in Palestine, especially in the post-Oslo period. When we were preparing this panel, you said that after Oslo, there was an increase in how funding became a political tool that very often serves Israeli agenda, and it even used as means of collective punishment. We would love to hear from you on this.
Thank you so much, Dunya. Thank you, Chef team. And thank you so much, Mike, for your powerful framing. I usually have a softer voice, but this is my sick voice, so bear with me. So yes, I'm Yara, I'm based in Ramallah, and I'm part of Owneh initiative. That is a young initiative and presenting an alternative to the funding models and advocating for a more equal and just system in Palestine. I'll speak about the Owneh first, and then I'll shed some light on the post-Oslo experience. And in the beginning, I would like to explain to you the meaning of Owneh in Arabic. Owneh is a word in Arabic that carries the essence of collective care and collective support. It's not an NGO term. It's a lived experience. It's a Palestinian act that is deeply rooted in the Palestinian culture and in the Palestinian community. If you just want to imagine the olive harvesting season in Palestine, the mountains filled with olive oils, and lots of people moving towards the fields in groups. These people are going to do the Owneh together, help each other, support each other. They go together for a joint cause. So why did Owneh come together? The Owneh that we are speaking about today. After the onset of the genocide in Gaza, after the October 2023, the Palestinian civil society experienced a new wave of politically conditioned, politically weaponized and conditions imposed by donors, who also at the same time rushed to validate and support the Israeli narrative and dehumanize Palestinians right after October 7th. So Owneh Initiative is a new Palestinian coalition that consists of 30 members. The majority of them are arts and culture organizations who came together to create a resource space that rejects any dictation from foreign funding and colonial funding. A space that has no space in it for any government that has resources, but it's complicit in the genocide in Gaza. No complicity is allowed. Owneh is not a registered entity. It works under the a financial umbrella with an association in Ramallah. The purpose of Owneh is to protect the Palestinian dignity by creating new ways for moving resources with the community, not over them. We have like a set of principles that guides our work in Owneh. For example, all members do not accept any conditional funding. All members do not accept any complicit any resources that comes from governments complicit in the genocide. We refuse funding that promote fragmentation, including geographical restrictions and also operational limitations. In Owneh, we work on 3 main pillars. The first one is called the resource basket, which is a shared pool for resources where the members of Owneh gather all their non-financial resources together and make them accessible and free of charge for the utilization of other members. And we mean here by non-financial is like an art space that have lots of spaces like an exhibition space, like a small garden or a piece of land, a training hall. We can share all these spaces together when any of the members do not have that space and in need of that space. Or for example, we can share our human resources, curators, translators, designers, all sorts of capacities that we have in-house. We can share them among each other in order to reduce the operational cost and programming cost, which is high rocketing in Palestine. The other component, the second component, is the Aid Watch, which is an online platform that Owneh is trying to revive. The platform main function is to monitor and analyze the colonial funding practices in Palestine and develop reports, position papers, analysis, aiming to raise awareness of Palestinians about the harm these practices are causing, but also at the same time, the platform works to push colonial funders to change these practices and try to practice solidarity instead. And of course, to hold them accountable. That's the main goal for the Aid Watch. Then the third one and the last one is the Solidarity Fund. This fund mobilizes financial resources to support members of Owneh who are going through financial crisis that threatens their existence, their continuity, because they have been rejecting a lot of funds. So this fund will extend grants to its members, like flexible, long-term care grants to help them with recovery, with independence and without limitation or interference from any external entity. This fund will be active by next year, maybe early next year to June, because we're trying to mobilize funds to support this fund by itself. If we want to look close and study the example of Owneh, we did not create Owneh because we wanted to create a new fund or a new institutions. There are lots of Palestinian funds, there are lots of Palestinian institutions, but we wanted to change the status quo through Owneh. We want to create an alternative experience. We wanted to learn whether this is going to work, whether or not. We wanted to say loudly that we refuse to let money continue to be a tool of oppression in Palestine, and that's the start. This is the information about Owneh. Probably these are heavy ideas or heavy points. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit towards the historical context of the foreign aid in Palestine and how this system has been working ever since, and specifically right when the Oslo Peace Accord was signed. Of course, for many people, Oslo Accords is defined or understood as a peace process. But for us Palestinians, we don't see it that way. It didn't end the occupation. It just rearranged the occupation. And of course, by doing that, it reduced the cost of the occupation, on the occupation. So since then, international donors poured huge amounts of money into the Palestinian society and the Palestinian civil society, caused a lot of harm. But of course, these funds came with terms, and these terms were shaped by the same people who shaped the peace deals that didn't work and failed greatly. So they were so much unjust for us Palestinians. And they also came tied to a vision of a state building that left the structure of colonization intact, which consequently made the system for Palestinian failed big time, failed in addressing our priorities and in addressing even our aspirations to liberation. On top of this, funding has never been constant. As Dunya said in the beginning, funding in Palestine can be cut at any moment. If Palestinians resist, if we speak too loudly, or sometimes as simple as our existence could become inconvenient to political interests. So the funding will be cut again. And even today, in this moment when Gaza is going through the genocide, many large international funds are still supporting Israel, sidelining Palestinians, as Mike said. Exactly when they most need to be heard. So this is what it looks like when money is used as a political weapon. When you think it's solidarity, but then it becomes a system for oppression, a system for control that we all need to fight. For us in Owneh, decolonizing funding is part of a broader struggle for global justice. Also, as Mike touched upon, it is our way to say our liberation should be bound together. Owneh is just one simple effort, one small effort, but it is a proof that there is another way. There is another way. Another way is possible. There is an alternative. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yara. Shukran.
Thank you.
It was really interesting to provide the attendees with a very concrete attempt to prove right that we are right in seeking alternative fundings, especially in the context of Palestine, which where funding and money are used as political tools, are weaponized, and that Palestinian organizations are actually threatened when they speak loud or they try to go, against the Western instructions of not speaking loudly. Thank you very much, Yara. I just want to turn to you, Naizi, and ask you about the what's going on in Latin America in general. I know you're from Brazil, and but I am sure you can take us to the region, especially that we know that the colonial movement as an academic research or a topic was born there. And in this context, if you can just give us an overview of how cultural organizations, structures, or individuals in your region are crafting innovative independent funding models in order to break away from the colonial global north conditioned funding mechanism based on your experience and knowledge of the region. Thank you very much. Can you please unmute Naizi so we can hear you? No, we are not hearing you. We still can't hear you.
Now you can.
Perfect. Yeah, please go
Okay.
ahead.
What a difficult moment we are, my friends, because it's apart from all the tragedy and all the real genocide and everything, we still have to deal with very complex and paradoxical governments and funding and relations where I wish we could all very quickly separate the good guys and the bad guys. And unfortunately, as you all know well, they are very good friends, the bad guys and the good guys, depending on their particular interests at the moment. So first, I would like to say thank you so much for giving this floor to me, but I am not the right person to be here. So I discussed that with Mike before. I'm a white person in a very privileged space in South America, which is real, considering the reality of Latin America in general, in terms of funding, in terms of visibility. So I'll try to kind of go through the experience, but really, I think we more and more in South America specifically, we have been very aware that we have to really stop talking, like white people should really take like a seat, because it's too much of us in every cultural scene. And we have, of course, now in Brazil, we have a very, very big reshift in terms of who gets to be funded and who gets to talk. And it's unprecedented, the level of exposure and possibilities for non-white people in the arts. Because of the government of Lula, the first 2 terms, then everything was lost for the 4 years of fascism and Bolsonaro. And then we are now back into cultural policy that's really inclusive, and it's trying to really to give the voice. So Brazilian situation is a bit more privileged in that way, not only because we have a democratic government, but also, and it's a government that is openly, in our particular discussion, openly against Israel and against the positions of Israel. Although internally, we could claim that it's doing very little for our own Black people genocide that has been on for decades. So in a way, very complex, but it's still better than being pro-Israel. So the president went to the UN 3 days ago and made a very harsh defense of the Palestinian state. But I mean, politics for me, it's a bit, I'm less optimistic about the UN and less optimistic about what these governments are saying and what they are indeed doing for any genocide, because the Palestinian genocide is this horrific thing that we are doing like daily checks on our mobiles of what is going on and how many people more were killed. While for a decade now, I have friends from Congo sending me the same horrific things and nobody was even mentioning it. So, I mean, genocide is just something that is going on for a very long time. And in Brazil, in South America, we call genocide what is happening to Black kids for a decade. Like in Brazil, 100 Black people are killed every day by the police forces. And it's just something that politicians pretend are not happening. So South America, I'm talking more about South America because it's really more of the region that I've been exchanging, but Latin America in general, although, as you know, the continent is too big for 10 minutes and it's too big for one person to speak from. But just to remember that this idea of decolonial funding has been around for 20 years at least in discussions here for everyone. We've been part of this. In 2001, with Natasha Mello, we created a group of people, the South American Network of Dance, that then became kind of a Latin American Network of Dance. And the main discussion was, how can we exist outside the framing of the colonial funding? Because our governments then were doing very little for the funding. I think there are some initiatives that have been trying to exchange different powers, regional powers, to face the colonial funding. And we here call colonial funding specifically funding from what we call the post-colonial cultural funding, like Institut Français, British Council, Goethe Institute, and their likes. Because for some regions, when the countries are less powerful, because Brazil has much more funding than these countries can fund us, but in smaller countries or in countries that are less organized in terms of cultural policy, this kind of funding is very relevant for the existence of local artists and institutions. So I've been discussing how to do it for a long time. I could say that generally the funding model for Latin America is governmental funding and NGO funding, and NGOs very commonly funded by European countries, mostly. In some places now we are seeing more Asian corporations, so more Asian money flooding into the region, of course, because of the geopolitical importance of kind of having more Chinese presence, for instance, in some places. But most of what I see from the performing arts, which is my field of work, is still very Europe-driven relations in terms of funding, especially international funding. Locally, Brazil has a very particular way of being funded in the arts. So 89% of our funding comes from tax rebate. And that is a very perverse kind of funding, because it means that the government allows companies to use 6% of their annual revenue tax to fund arts, but then the decision is from the companies, meaning that there is no, it's not that they put all the money into a fund and then the government has a policy for that. It means it's just me going to the government and saying, this is my festival, and they give me a paper that says, your festival is important, is relevant, you are an honest person, you don't commit any crime, you can go to any big company in the country and ask for money for your festival, and they can then give us a paper that says that they gave you money and we take this money out of their taxes. So basically, it's marketing people deciding what is to be done with taxes, ultimately. So so that, talking about money that comes with rules and money that comes with political implications, that's the basic headline here. So in our case, for instance, in Panorama, we've been dealing with this all the time. Like, the government is pro-Palestine, but not all companies are. So we are like navigating what kind of money can we pretend to be nice, because we know no funding is nice, but we kind of can deal better with some kinds of funding. So this is one thing. And I think most companies and most festivals in the Latin America region are all dealing with governmental money that comes with some attachments always. But most Latin American is it's against Israel at that moment. So it's not that horrific. The other thing is, how do you deal with international funding? So I will just leave, because we have a little time, two things that maybe also one of them could be helpful to my friends trying to organize alternative models. So two things that we did over the years, and some of my peers in different countries in Latin America have done that, is to really organize ourselves in terms of how we let French institutions, German institutions, Belgian institutions give us money. Because originally they would come and say, this is the artist that we propose is touring, and we are paying for the tour. That's how they operate. And they continue to do that in Africa. And we started refusing that and saying, you don't get to pick the artist. We pick the artist and you pay for it, but we don't allow you to do it. And for some festivals, it became like there's no international funding, because they wanted to use the artists to propagate what a kind of discourse that they wanted. And we wanted the ones that sometimes were not the most friendly ones to their governments. So that started to shift a bit. And we were able, like, the stronger the festival is, or the stronger it's rooted in their community, we could do that. And in my festival, we could do that. We do that still. So we refuse a lot of funding. But also, at some point during the pandemic, we started a project that's maybe it's more in the lines of what should have been happening. And I think we more and more have to look into it if we want to continue creating all the spaces for funding. So during the pandemic, we had no funding. After basically when Bolsonaro was elected, we lost our funding because we were campaigning against him throughout the campaign. So when he started, all festivals lost their funding unless they were very complicit with the government. So we lost our funding. And when the pandemic hit, we were doing Panorama in France as kind of an exile project. They invited us to do that, to talk about what's happening in Brazil. And I came back and we realized that not only there was no funding here, but we could not be at mercy of international funding to continue to exist, at least in an online situation. So we created a project that was called Panorama Raft. We did a local version with some COVID aid money that we got, that was called Jangada. Jangada is the Brazilian, like the indigenous boat that you just attach some trees together and you kind of make a very precarious floating device, temporary floating device. So the first project was the Panorama Jangada, which was the floating, like a temporary floating device instead of a festival. So we could get money and give money to artists. Then we devised the Panorama Raft, and the Panorama Raft is the one that interests me a bit here because it's not, of course, a solution, but it's the way that we funded it was there was no funding, and we didn't want to go for international official governmental funding. So basically, we called a lot of rich partners in Europe and the US and said, normally you would come to Brazil to discover artists and to program or to visit, and you would spend an amount of euros doing that. You cannot do that now, but those euros are in your budget. So give those euros to us, and we will give those euros to artists to produce work while they cannot get funding. And one thing that happened with this is that the artists, we were stuck with this idea that I think has to do with what YARA was talking about, is that some of these places, they said, okay, we give you money, but we want to know which artists, because we want to choose the artists. And a very good artist from Brazil, Marcelo Evelyn, from the northeast of Brazil, he called me and he said, you can't let them choose. They cannot be in charge. We want their money, but we don't want their ideas. We don't want their, we don't want basically anything else but their articulation to get more money and their own money. So basically, we got 20 different partners in different places of the world to give us money, not knowing which artist was going to be funded. So we got this pot and we made Brazilian curators choose. And basically, we could then make the kind of pot that YARA was talking about, but using international partnerships. Of course, that now is a bit more complicated because some of those institutions now, we would not be so comfortable getting money from because they haven't been very clear about their position. But I think the idea that we can, between us, escape the logic of the big money coming to our regions, it's so real. And we of course, we are desperate for funds. Everybody has to pay their bills and the artists are starving everywhere. But we have, as YARA said, to truly believe that it's possible that African countries, there are rich countries, my country, that is a very rich country, can subsidize themselves outside some of the logics. The problem is that we have very big problems talking to our own governments. Our own governments are much more interested in international work than in local work. So for me, for the region in general, I've seen more and more, international cooperation between the region, but smaller work, small funded work. And I think that's the reality for now, smaller projects that can be done outside the big stream of money. But I think if we can get more and more of those projects to be kind of pilot projects that we can go to governments and say, this is a model. Let's forget the money flowing from the US and let's go for money coming from different parts of Africa. And like we can really try to make that happen. My question for all of us is how can we include that work in our already overloaded work? That's my fundamental work ask for all of us.
Thank you. That's a good question, Naizi. And I think that it is exactly what the purpose of this panel is, the why, but also the how. And we've got some examples from the three of you. Thank you very much. That was very rich and complete. I try to just to wrap up what you said, and the main idea about the importance of cutting the ties with institutional, even governmental funding in some parts of the world. We saw some exceptions, like you have just said, for Brazil. Even if we are taxpayers and that the money is coming from our taxes, sometimes you just refrain from taking the money of the government because of other considerations. Also, the importance of having civil society organizations driving these alternatives and solutions and trying to create other options for funding the arts, the importance of advocating for decolonized cultural policies and funding strategies that are implemented in the countries. We also heard from you very interesting actions, such as taking the money, but making the partners respect some rules, like how they choose the artist and how you select your partners and how you use some funds in very specific occasions like COVID-19 to actually make production projects, and the idea of doing more smaller projects but more impactful and try to advocate through them to the government and any public institutions in our own context. I am afraid I'm happy to open the floor for the questions from the audience.